During a fiery live interview, Karoline, the newly appointed White House press secretary, delivers a scathing takedown of a liberal television host after he makes shocking anti-Trump remarks. The intense exchange leaves the host speechless, and the fallout is immediate, resulting in his sudden dismissal. The moment has sparked massive controversy, with reactions pouring in from all sides. Watch the full clip to see how Karoline dismantles the host's biased rhetoric with facts and confidence. The air in the studio was thick with tension. The cameras rolled, and the lights blazed down on the polished glass desk. Millions of Americans were watching. Karoline, the newly appointed White House press secretary, sat poised and composed. Across from her was Martin Graves, the sharp-tongued television host, notorious for his aggressive questioning of conservative figures. The segment had barely begun when Graves leaned forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "Miss Karoline, let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "How does it feel to work for a man who has been nothing but a failure? A man who's lost his grip on reality? A man who, let's be honest, doesn't know what he's doing? Isn't it embarrassing defending someone who's clearly unfit?" The words sent a hush through the control room. Even the cameraman stiffened. Karoline blinked once, twice, then she did something unexpected. She smiled a slow, knowing smile that sent a ripple of unease across Graves's face. "Are you finished, Mr. Graves?" she asked, her voice calm. Graves chuckled. "Oh, I've just started." The battle had begun. Karoline tilted her head, her confidence unwavering. She had been prepared for hostility, but this was beyond disrespectful. She leaned in slightly, her gaze locking onto Graves's. "You sit here," she began, "in your comfortable chair, collecting your fat paycheck, spewing lies to millions. You insult a man who has built businesses, created jobs, and fought for this country. And yet," she let the moment hang, "you contribute nothing but cheap insults. Tell me, Mr. Graves, how does it feel to be the one who's failing?" Graves shifted in his seat, caught off guard. He opened his mouth, but Karoline continued. "You call President Trump a failure, unfit. Do you know what failure looks like, Mr. Graves? Failure is sitting in that chair, using your platform to spread hate instead of truth. Failure is thinking you can silence people who refuse to bow to your bias." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the producers watching from behind the glass were frozen. Graves had expected an easy takedown. Instead, he was facing a force of nature. And the worst part? She wasn't done yet. Graves tried to regain control, but his voice cracked slightly. "That's rich coming from someone who—" Karoline cut him off, her voice sharper now. "No, Mr. Graves, you don't get to spin this." She reached for the papers in front of her. "Let's talk facts. Under President Trump, the economy saw historic growth. Unemployment hit record lows. America became energy independent. Our military was strengthened. And yet, you sit here, pushing a narrative that completely ignores reality." Graves blinked. His silence spoke volumes. Karoline leaned forward just an inch. "Your job is to inform. But what do you do instead? You mock. You belittle. You think if you say something with enough arrogance, people will believe it. But Americans are smarter than you give them credit for. They see through this. They see you." A long pause. The weight of her words filled the room. Graves swallowed, his hands clenched beneath the table. Then, in his earpiece, the voice of his producer crackled, "Wrap it up, now." But it was too late. Karoline had won. The silence in the studio was suffocating. Martin Graves, the once dominant television host, sat frozen, his carefully crafted arrogance starting to crack. Karoline, calm as ever, adjusted the mic clip on her blazer and spoke with measured confidence. "You say President Trump is a failure, but let's look at real failures, shall we? The people who mock leaders instead of contributing. The media figures who mislead millions while pretending to be journalists." Graves cleared his throat, his fingers tapping anxiously on the desk. "That's not—" Karoline didn't let him finish. "You think you can bully me into silence? You thought you'd bring me here and push a false narrative? Mr. Graves, I was not sent here to play games. I was sent here to tell the truth." The control room was in chaos. The producer was signaling, desperate to cut to commercial. But this was live. Millions were glued to their screens, watching history unfold. Graves swallowed hard. The audience could see it know his confidence was slipping. But Karoline? She was only getting started. A bead of sweat formed at Graves's temple. He shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. "You're twisting my words," he muttered, voice faltering. Karoline didn't flinch. "I don't need to twist your words. You do that all by yourself." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, making the moment feel even heavier. "You called President Trump unfit. But tell me, Mr. Graves, do you know what sickness looks like? Sickness is when the media manipulates facts for personal gain. Sickness is when journalists no longer report but attack. Sickness is when the truth is buried under an agenda." Graves tried to interrupt. "This isn't—" Karoline continued. "No, Mr. Graves, you made your bed. Now you lie in it." The room was silent. The weight of her words settled over the entire studio. Even the control room, usually buzzing with voices, was eerily still. Graves, for the first time in his career, was speechless. The interview had taken a turn no one had expected. Graves sat back, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who asked the questions, who controlled the narrative. But now, his own arrogance had become his downfall. Karoline kept her gaze steady. "You sit here and mock a man who has given everything to this country. But tell me, Mr. Graves, what have you given? Other than division? Other than lies?" Graves opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched on. It was unbearable. The control room had given up on saving him. The cameras stayed rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation. Then, the unthinkable happened. The producer's voice came through his earpiece, cold and final. "Martin, you're done." His eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. Karoline sat back, calm, unshaken. She didn't need to say another word, because the world had just witnessed the end of Martin Graves. The studio air felt thick. Outside, across America, millions sat frozen in front of their screens. Some clutched their phones, recording what was now destined to become the most viral moment in modern television. Others stared wide-eyed as Karoline sat unshaken, her words cutting through the deception like a blade. Martin Graves, once the untouchable host, was now visibly unraveling. His hands trembled as he tried to force out a response. But it was too late. The power had shifted. In the control room, the producer was panicking. "Get us to commercial, now." "No," the director muttered. "This is history." Viewers across the nation watched, hearts pounding, knowing they were witnessing something rare. Justice in real time. Karoline didn't just defend President Trump, she exposed a broken media system that had silenced truth for too long. Then, the breaking news banner flashed across the screen. "Live, White House press secretary obliterates television host in shocking showdown." The internet had already exploded, and the night wasn't over yet. As the realization sank in, Martin Graves looked into the camera, his face pale. He had lost control of the interview, his show, and possibly his career. His voice cracked. "Miss Karoline, I think we—" Karoline raised a hand. "Mr. Graves, there's no recovering from this. You called the president a failure, yet here you sit, unable to answer a single question without deflecting." Graves swallowed. His voice was barely a whisper. "I was just asking tough questions." Karoline's eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down the audience's spine. "No, Mr. Graves. A tough question challenges facts. A tough question seeks truth. You weren't asking tough questions. You were attacking a man who has done more for this country than you ever will." The studio was dead silent. Even Graves's own staff refused to meet his gaze. Somewhere, in millions of homes across America, people began to weep not out of sadness, but out of something much deeper, relief. For the first time, someone had spoken for them. And the battle wasn't over yet. Graves let out a shaky breath. His mind raced. He had interviewed presidents, celebrities, and political figures for years. He had always come out on top. Not this time. His earpiece crackled again. This time, the voice was different. It wasn't the panicked producer. It was corporate. "Martin, we're done. You're off the air after this segment." He blinked rapidly. His entire career was crumbling in real time. Karoline saw it. She knew. And yet, she didn't gloat. She didn't have to. She simply straightened her blazer and delivered the final blow. The American people deserve better than this, Mr. Graves. And tonight, they got it. Graves couldn't speak. The red light of the camera blinked. Still live. Millions of viewers, still glued to their screens, knew what they had just seen. A legacy shattered. A truth defended. And Karoline Leavitt had just made history. The moment the interview ended, the screen cut to black for a commercial break, but the damage was done. Inside the studio, Martin Graves sat motionless, staring at the desk. His face was pale. His hands shook slightly. He had just been fired on live television, in front of millions. Karoline stood up gracefully, adjusted her blazer, and looked at him one last time. There was no smugness in her expression, no arrogance, just quiet strength. In homes across America, people burst into tears. Some had watched their values mocked by the media for years. Tonight, they finally saw someone fight back, with facts, with grace, with power. Social media exploded. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube flooded with clips of the moment. Karoline destroys liberal media. Truth wins. Graves fired. People weren't just watching history, they were part of it. In that moment, Karoline had become a symbol of strength, of truth, of fighting back. And for Martin Graves, his world was about to collapse. Back in the newsroom, chaos erupted. Phones rang non-stop. Executives shouted over each other. The network's PR team was in full crisis mode. "This is bad," one producer muttered, scrolling through Twitter. "It's everywhere." "Bad?" Another producer looked up. "Are you kidding? This is the biggest moment in television history." Karoline, now walking calmly out of the studio, glanced at her phone. It was buzzing relentlessly, texts, calls, emails. She took a deep breath. She had done her job not just for President Trump, but for every American who had been silenced, dismissed, and ridiculed. Meanwhile, Martin Graves sat alone in his dressing room. He ignored the knocking on his door. His career, his identity, had just been shattered. And the worst part? The world was celebrating it. Outside the studio, people had gathered. Some held American flags. Others had their phones raised, recording live. Karoline stepped out, the cold night air hitting her skin. A woman rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she choked out. "Thank you for standing up for us." An older man in a Vietnam veteran hat nodded, his voice breaking. "You gave us our voice back tonight." Karoline smiled, blinking back her own tears. She hadn't done this for fame. She had done it because it was right. Meanwhile, inside his dark dressing room, Martin Graves sat, staring at the floor. His phone buzzed. A message from the network. "Your contract has been terminated, effective immediately." He let out a slow, shaking breath. It was over. Back outside, Karoline looked up at the sky, knowing that tonight, something had changed forever, and America would never be the same. As Karoline stepped into her car, she finally exhaled. The moment had happened, and there was no turning back. Her phone kept vibrating texts from colleagues, supporters, even strangers. One message stood out. "You didn't just win. You made history. America will never forget this night." Meanwhile, the internet had erupted. YouTube was flooded with clips of the takedown. TikTok was filled with emotional reactions. Facebook was ablaze with debates. But something even bigger was happening. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Families sat together, tears in their eyes, finally seeing someone defend what they believed in. Veterans saluted their screens, whispering, "Finally." Mothers hugged their children, knowing that, for once, truth had won. And inside the cold, empty dressing room, Martin Graves stared at his phone. His inbox was filling not with sympathy, but with resignation emails from his sponsors. The fall had begun. Karoline sat in the back seat of her car, watching the news unfold in real time. Every channel was playing the moment, a shocking and historic takedown. The press secretary who turned the tables on the media, Martin Graves fired after disastrous interview. She thought of all the people who had been silenced before, all the conservatives who had been humiliated, mocked, and ignored. Not tonight. Tonight the truth had stood tall. As her drive turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, a call came in. Karoline, the voice on the other end, said, filled with pride, "It was President Trump. I saw what you did. And let me tell you something, I couldn't have done it better myself." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she knew this was only the beginning, and she was ready. Martin Graves sat in his dressing room, his head in his hands. He could still hear her words echoing in his mind. "You made your bed. Now you lie in it." A producer knocked. "Martin, they're waiting for a statement." He laughed bitterly. A statement? What could he even say? That he was sorry? That he had underestimated her? That for the first time in his career, he had lost? He looked at himself in the mirror, his face pale, his reputation shattered. For years, he had been untouchable. But tonight, Karoline had ended it all in less than 10 minutes. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tell them I have nothing to say." And with that, the door closed behind him.